This is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today, again, is Randy Baier. We're going to talk about books, academic books, and a variety of topics. Welcome to Rip Rap.
Thanks for having me back once again.
A book that I got a little while ago, last year, but now is called The Secretary by Kim Gaddis, A Journey with Hillary Clinton from Beirut to the Heart of American Power. What's interesting is that Kim Gaddis was from Beirut.
Oh.
So there's a whole different perspective.
You mean she grew up in Beirut?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
She said, I grew up in Beirut on the front lines of the Civil War.
She grew up in Beirut?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Her father always said, if America wanted the fighting to end, the war would be over tomorrow. He waited for 15 years for the guns to fall silent. The question she raises, did America not care that people were being killed? Did it not have the power to stop the bloodshed? Were we just a pawn in the hands of the neo-colonial imperial power? And why were we all blaming this distant land for a war anyway? Some very interesting questions that still exist today with the fighting that's going on.
So these were questions that were coming from people in Beirut.
Yeah.
In other words, are we the hand in her mind, and the imperial power being the United States to her? Yes. Yeah.
What are we doing there, and why are we doing it?
Right. Yeah.
And then she said, as a child, I never imagined I would one day live in that distant land and be able to put some of those questions to the American Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. So there's this person who is of the indigenous people who then, by circumstances, becomes into the circle of power, who can then address, the person in power.
And Secretary Clinton gave her access to discuss this.
And I found it a bit sexist to keep talking about Madam Secretary, but Madeleine Albright, one of Hillary Clinton's predecessors, also wrote a book called Madam Secretary. So it's a formal title, but she's introduced now in all the debates as Madam Secretary or Secretary. So I found that pretty interesting, and it just plays out this whole interesting, circles of power, and the author says, when Clinton took on the challenge of restoring America's reputation, the United States was at a crossroad. Its influence shunned by others after 8 years of the Bush administration. As Barack Obama's envoy to the world, Clinton set out to make her country a wanted power once more, finding new spheres of influence and exploring the new frontiers of 21st century diplomacy from her very first day at the State Department. And I find this is a very interesting point because we're in the middle of the debates going into the... I can't watch all the debates anymore. I watch the first minute or so and then I got...
I find out 2 days later that there was a debate. I don't even know how... I mean, I do watch news programs. You'd think I would be in the news cycle, it would be well known, but there seem to be so many of them, and in this particular season, and it seemed very repetitive. So,
well, we can't watch the whole thing. It's demeaning. The Republican thing is the worst example of it, but I just can't watch it. It's just too much. She begins part one in this book with a quote from a Palestinian CIA informative. You are the agents of innocence. That is why you make so much mischief. He's talking about the United States. Mm-hmm. You come into a place like Lebanon as if you were missionaries. Now, there's a loaded word for people who are not a colonial power. Mm-hmm. You convince people to put aside their old customs and allegiances and to break the bonds that hold the country together. With your money and your schools and your cigarettes and music, you convince us that we can be like you, but we can't. And when the real trouble begins, you are gone. Mm-hmm. and you leave your friends, the ones who trusted you the most, to die, I will tell you what it is. Your urge is to open up the windows of heaven, but you do not realize that the downpour will come rushing and drown us all. And that's what's happened. I mean, there's a line of argumentation that when we took out Saddam Hussein, that's what started the terrorists like ISIS and so forth.
Well, I remember that. Well, this has deep historical roots, doesn't it? I mean, back in the 70s and probably more historical wars before the world wars, but I mean, we have been accused of getting heavily involved and then leaving, and at the same time believing that, was it Bush and Cheney were pushing, that the Iraqis will be so happy when we come and spread democracy to them. They'll be, waving their flags in the street. And just the opposite has occurred, of course.
Well, Karl Rove,
it's a little more complex than that, but
Dick Cheney, all selling the business of business.
The Rovian solutions. Yeah.
But I thought this was a useful perspective on Clinton as a major power broker and administrator and bureaucrat in the machine of the neo-colonial power. And now that she's running for president, it makes more sense.
Does the writers' questions get answered sufficiently? I mean, it's a very it seems like a quite thorough volume. Does she provide an analysis of the answers?
Well, at the end of the book, she says, as a superpower, America has been more than willing than past empires to share the world it has made, and there's something there to hold on to. It's kind of interesting. The difference between American power when I lived on the receiving end of it and today is the gap between what America says it's doing and what it is doing is becoming narrower. The difference between then and now is Tier Square, Twitter, the Syrian rebels, Chen Guangqing, and all those who are no longer willing to be taken for granted, not by the United States and not by their own rulers. Knee-jerk reactions blaming every wrong on America are outdated and not very productive. There are too many ways to effect change without the United States or harness American power to advance one's cause. So I find it fascinating. She comes to kind of a middle ground, but it's speaking from a perspective of an indigenous person who is now located in the center of power and reflecting on it. And I thought that's really interesting. And she said, I had reached the end of my own journey too. I still struggle to accept the Syrian invasion of Lebanon was one of those inconsistencies of American foreign policy. But I had met the human beings at the heart of the American foreign policy machine, and I was willing to accept that they did not make decisions about the war and peace blithely, at least not anymore. So I found that pretty interesting. We talked about Madam Secretary, and I was objecting to the sexist term, but then you realize this woman, Hillary Clinton, was at the center of what was going on. And there's a considerable amount of geopolitics involved, with effects on people like the author, Chavez, who are wondering, well, what's going to happen now?
Still can. I mean, they're right in the middle of
you can't even comprehend what's
war
going
theaters.
on. I mean, the ISIS, they go on and blow a town up, or they, have suicide bombers going to a police station. It just is beyond belief. One of the books we have I thought you might find interesting was the one on visual storytelling.
Right, visual storytelling, an illustrated reader. It appears to be interviews with various authors who have done graphic novels or comics or illustrated literature, however you want to. I guess comics might be offensive to some, but comics might be, let's call it a comic. Why not? It works.
Well, call them graphic narratives.
Graphic narrative, yeah. Actually, in the library where I do my daily work, we've started for several years now. We've collected graphic literature. There's courses taught and a lot more. It's taken much more seriously than just popular culture and Marvel comics and that sort of thing. Quite a bit, but the book is a series of. It's by Todd James Pierce of Cal Poly and Ryan Van Cleve of Ringling College of Art and Design, published by Oxford. And it is illustrated with interviews by these various authors about ideas and themes: young adulthood, men and women, identity, trauma, politics, the arts, and history, and talking about various graphic works that have sort of touched on those themes.
What I found interesting is this is the response of academic literature to the huge interest into visual and multimedia outlets, and that they're having to respond to that because that's where the students are. They're watching television, they're watching the social media, and all that stuff, and so they regard a lot of the traditional academic literature as boring.
Right. It's actually it's interesting how moving images, short videos and whatnot, or still videos made from still images, but you're moving from one to the next. How I've been struck at how students are so competent at that now. To make a short video is a way that they kind of create their take on knowledge. It's different, obviously, from writing a kind of thoughtful essay of ideas with topic sentences and things like that. But it's also very analogous to that process. In creating a 1 or 2 minute video, in some ways works very effectively, especially in some of the. It depends on the class, I suppose, but or the topic. But the task at hand, what your assignment is to try to capture an idea or something of that nature.
My experience has been it introduces additional elements into the reflective process. And I noticed that they included a comment by Scott McCloud, and we interviewed Scott McCloud in his book.
Yeah, I see one of his books behind you.
And he talked about the difference in perspective between Western graphic novels and Japanese. The Western is still very much the story, like vaudeville. It's from one side. The Japanese and very literal spatial relationships. Japanese is three-dimensional. It can be a viewpoint from any perspective.
Right.
And the things that indicate movement in Western comics are more metaphysical in Japanese comics. So in Western comics, if you have those lines indicate movement, it's literally movement. But in Japanese comics, it might indicate a metaphysical transfer.
Oh, right, or time or something like that, rather than a spatial type of thing. I think in historical terms, in either Western art or iconography, there were times when storytelling was done from done from a multiple perspective at once. In the same plane of a picture, you would see different moments of time. For instance, something biblical, where there was maybe a linear story, but you would see all parts of the story on the same canvas. And as a viewer, being part of that culture, that was part of the visual knowledge that you had to have in order to interpret that story. But you probably knew the story in one way or another through oral traditions of some kind. So it's an interesting.
My first reaction to this book is that I felt maybe it was a little too literal.
In what way?
in the title of storytelling
Oh,
instead of perhaps story narrative or something that's
oh,
more
okay, or
organic.
visual narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me ask you, do you find narrative by definition or by imagination to be linear? When I say the word narrative to you, do you think
Not as much as I do storytelling. Storytelling to me is a very linear concept. Narrative could have other elements in it.
because of the word telling? Because telling,
Story.
obviously,
Story
if
is
you're
a
telling
very
something,
specific
there's a
genre.
beginning and a, there's a continual.
Story is a very specific genre.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm saying, there's these complexities that arise when you try to, involve nonlinear concepts in it, so that it doesn't work all that easily.
Right.
And you need to take into account those other dimensions. But when I saw that title, I thought, well, that's just too limiting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it struggles with it, so the interpretive part.
So it does come up in the book, in other words.
Well, yeah, but
Questioning.
the way the book is structured is primarily narrative in, graphic narrative.
Right, graphic narrative, yeah.
And then you have sections at the end that are questions by the people who are trying to raise the issues, which is really kind of a incomplete, gelling of the process. And that's what I'm saying, there's these complexities that arise when you try to, involve nonlinear concepts in it, so that it doesn't work all that easily.
Right.
And you need to take into account those other dimensions. But when I saw that title, I thought, well, that's just too limiting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it struggles with it, so the interpretive part.
So it does come up in the book, in other words.
Well, yeah, but
Questioning.
the way the book is structured is primarily narrative in, graphic narrative.
Right, graphic narrative, yeah.
And then you have sections at the end that are questions by the people who are trying to raise the issues, which is really kind of a incomplete, gelling of the process.
Show an example of a graphic artist's work,
Yeah.
graphic storyteller's
And
work.
just add questions.
And then ask the questions, and then go on to the next chapter.
Yeah, that doesn't have an overwhelming,
Right.
overbearing, point. It's just sort of, thrown together kind of a thing, because,
Yeah.
well, we've got to do this, of course.
Yeah.
And that's why they call it a reader, I think, is because they're giving you samples of it.
In going through here, it looks like we have touched on, works for adults or older people. Older meaning not children's books, but I'm thinking entirely as we're flipping through here of what the differences would be to talk to children's illustrators or storytellers, because as a genre, it's an incredibly rich, meaningful genre of narrative, where ideas are expressed in visual form and almost in ways where it's not entirely linear. But I'm thinking of various authors as I speak here, Maurice Sendak, or even the Goodnight Moon, this classic children's book illustration, Runaway Bunny, things of those things that you might read to kids. Faith Ringwald's descriptions of my grandmother's chair, and visually things seem to leap around, and maybe they work for a child's mind in I think very sophisticated ways. I mean, the idea is there visually, and it's making a leap from one image to the next. not connected maybe in quite the same way that it might be for adults. I don't know, this is just a question that's coming up.
Well, what I was hoping for is they would take maybe images or symbols or metaphors.
Oh, from within,
You know,
the plane
do
of
kind
the
of a
story.
cross
yeah,
thing.
like one page.
Instead of just questions at the end of what did you think about
Right,
that?
what is this telling us about the cultural,
Because in
the cultural
storytelling,
trope or
there
something of that nature?
there are some
Ongoing motifs, or what do you want to say, that are very powerful and potent
Yeah.
across cultures.
Yeah,
Although different cultures have different ways of portraying them. But it's, like I said, the moon may be regarded one way in one culture and regarded as another in another. Or even how it's portrayed. Because when you're doing the portrayal, that also is an interpretation. And so then that starts to have its own, force, its own intellectual dimension as interpreted. And I found this book to be pretty weak on, interpreting what was going on.
yeah. Yeah, that's it. It's an interesting comment. I mean, symbolically, I guess a story like Goodnight Moon is really about, I've always thought of it anyway, kind of psychological release or rest at the end of the day. Obviously you're trying to get the child to sleep, but your mind has to change over into kind of, you have to let the day go, and by counting off all these objects in that story, good night moon, good night hairbrush, good night this, good night that, everything gets sort of settled for the day, and you're ready for the next stage, which is sleep. You have to go to sleep. But that's the metaphor that's at work there, or the work behind the scenes is what those images are. And it's interactive. There's generally a parent reading that story, or a child reading it to themselves, and finding that kind of relaxation within.
So see, in indigenous cultures, there isn't a demarcation between kids and adults. All storytelling is important to all people. And so you tell stories to help make sense of what your life is. Going all the way back to the creation myth, and that story. In Western culture, in our culture, we distinguish between children and adults. And I think we lose something with that, because we need to tell stories about what we've been through and what we're going through. You see, in indigenous cultures, there isn't a demarcation between kids and adults. All storytelling is important to all people. And so you tell stories to help make sense of what your life is. Going all the way back to the creation myth, and that story. In Western culture, in our culture, we distinguish between children and adults. And I think we lose something with that, because we need to tell stories about what we've been through and what we're going through.
So many people have commented on the fact that hearing the stories of elders while children are present is a really powerful way to bond. And also we, I guess, in some ways, I don't know if it's American culture or high-paced Western urban culture, there's not enough opportunity to hear, what Grandpa and Grandma went through. I mean, you're just sort of going through and...
Well, first of all, I don't think...
We live in a context where everyone's very close.
I don't think we share as much. We don't sit down. People don't even sit down for dinner. So there aren't those moments
The
of
simple
a shared
gestures of shared
experience,
yeah.
and appreciation of the importance of that shared experience.
Right.
That it has a huge impact on youth.
Right.
It also has an impact on adults and those who are facing the end of their life, because it helps make sense of what's going on. But in the rush to try to appease the younger generation's fondness for, all kinds of things, visual, audio, and so forth, I think that some academic literature is short-circuiting the full benefits of what it would be like to incorporate it and to fully understand it.
That's an interesting take. Wish we had another book to. You want to analyze the nature of academic literature now, because it, I mean, at its best, it looks really deeply and granular at a particular issue, but at its worst, it could be so completely arcane that it doesn't have any integrative apart from a small circle of friends.
This is a significant investment in an attempt
Yeah.
to bridge the gap between the so-called millennial theory of,
Oh, the graphic aspect, you
Yeah.
mean? Yeah, the visual. Right,
Yeah.
right.
and that's what I'm concerned about,
Right.
is it's not quite there. You know, just showing a whole bunch of stuff isn't the same thing as, you know, an eloquent
Right.
interpretation.
Really going into it. Because visual storytelling or visual narrative has an incredible, powerful, beneficial use across cultures. I mean, we know that. You could look at indigenous, you're calling indigenous cultures, non-Western, I guess, or, you know, highly developed, wrong word, you know, modern, urban, developed, technological, complex, not the indigenous cultures. I can't use these terms because they go across categories and
Well,
I have my
it's not
little,
exactly
you know,
non-Western, because you have Native American
yeah,
cultures that
yeah.
have that indigenous
yeah.
dimension.
Nowadays, that's the way the world is you'll have what you might call indigenous cultures who are, you know, on cell phone and Twitter and Facebook, and so where's the line? You know, there's no line anymore.
We're in an era right now where the leading Republican candidate is notorious for his Twitter posts,
Right.
you know,
Right.
it's 140 characters.
But the power of the visual to explain and comment on and create cultural knowledge is, you know, I mean, look at what we have as evidence 25,000, 26,000 years ago in the caves around the world, in various places around the world, but, you know, Western Europe, Spain, France, there, Lascaux and whatnot. I mean, that's
I think the value.
knowledge.
I think the value of this book's an attempt to bring together the different narratives that exist and to evaluate them, to begin a discussion. I'd say.
Right.
And I think that's the beginning of a discussion. But there's much more work that needs to be done. But the other point I'm trying to make is, you know, there's a temptation that you bring something new in and that's all you got to do. Well, it's not quite that simple.
No. Right.
Because it bring, like I said, it brings in other components, it brings in other insights and factors and dynamics that you hadn't anticipated, and then you got to stand back and look at that too. Well, thank you for being.
You're welcome. It was a good way to end.
Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the host and executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. And what I'd like to do right now is to share with you how our unique and historic television series can use academic research to bring exciting, vital insights into important topics that affect our everyday lives. What kinds of topics? The politics and other dynamics that produce the gasoline from foreign countries for gasoline in the cars we drive. The way we care for ourselves and our family. our sense of fashion